A fish story and a Bible. I grew up in Luttrell, Tennessee, same as Chet Atkins. I walked the same dusty country roads, but 30 years later. There wasn't much to do there except farm and starve. I had it easier since times were better in the 50s. Among the limited opportunities, Chet got good on a Gretsch guitar. Real good. 1 in a million. I got pretty good with a Mitchell reel. For bass fishing, of course. Maybe top 5 out of 20. But good enough to make a living. I'm retired now. Made a little in bass fishing tournaments and sold some crankbait and topwater patents to a big company. Now, I don't know anything about music. I tried to learn some chords on an old Martin at grade school. I kind of learned the basic 3, and I could jump onto the E with some nimbleness. And I think I could have added Harlan Howard's crucial 4th element, the truth. But there are a lot of ways you can go with the truth, and I always felt that bass fishing was the one for me. Now I'm going to bear down on this comparison between guitar picking and bass fishing a little bit. Like I say, there weren't many choices in Union County around Norris Lake. As I understand the story, Chet, following Merle Travis up in Kentucky, which is not so far away, figured out a method to play the bass. Note the similarity in the two words bass and bass. Or is that bass and bass? A method to pick the bass line of a song on his guitar with his thumb and then pursue the melody independently with between 1 and 3 fingers. I'm going to tell you right now that describes bass fishing to a T. The reel with the rod and line is the instrument, with the thumb and fingers involved in casting and retrieve, and the melody is played separately at the far end of the line. It's what you do with the lure, the twitches, the depth, the pauses, as you work it through or around the lake cover. Smooth, staccato, adagio, allegro, all of it. That's the melody. That could be what separates a great fisherman. The ability to use his fingers to make the lure dance to a melody at the far end of the line in a way the others can't do. In that sense, maybe the explosion of a big fish out of the water is like an audience reaction. I don't know. And the whole idea is you practice and practice your technique and constantly put yourself to the test. You're always trying something a little new, trying to work it into your strategy and execution. You're never satisfied and always amazed at the nuances of the thing. And it's an end in itself. It will occupy every physical and mental ability or compartment you've got. Actually, I got no business talking about the guitar since I never got anywhere with it. But I think I recognize the absorption and dedication to the task. Maybe I'm trying to elevate myself a bit into Chet Atkins' realm. If so, it is so that I can tell you without hesitation that I knew a man who was not 5 out of 20 like me at bass fishing, or 1 in a million like Chet with his playing, but 1 in everybody on this planet in bass fishing. I'm good enough at that I know true, overpowering, one-of-a-kind greatness when I see it. Of course, I really didn't know old Tommy. I was too young and too shy to even talk to him. This is back in the 60s. but I knew about him, and I used to cut through his back lot after school when I was heading down to the lake with my fishing rod. He could see me when he was sitting on his back porch. He lived up on the ridge above Hickory Star Dock with a view to the various arms of the lake stretching north, east, and west. Everybody knew he could watch the weather from up there and tailor a day's fishing accordingly. Weather affects different parts of the lake differently. Wind and light conditions, temperature, of course, affect strategy. Some days you're going to confine yourself to Clear Creek entirely. Others, only to deep bluff drop-offs like off the back of F Island. You need to get the big picture before you start in on the details. I was pretty sure old Tommy didn't mind me crossing his property. I knew he could see I was a fisherman, and one fisherman to another, we cut each other quite a bit of slack in this world. And old Tommy would know that I knew a lot about him. Everybody who ever fished in Norris Lake would know a lot about old Tommy. Because Tommy was the oldest and hardest and wisest and greatest bass fisherman who ever lived, at least in those parts, probably anywhere. Just the light way he carried his tackle at the dock was different from everybody else. The way he walked. Some thought old Tommy had a magic fishing rod. That was the only explanation they could think of. He could catch fish in places where no one could catch fish, where there were no fish, where there was no water. Well, maybe not no water, but I would have believed it if somebody had said it. Everybody else would have too. And they were big fish, and numerous fish, and lots of them. Some of them weren't even bass. Some were unusual. If the question was, what is the biggest sauger you ever heard of? Then the answer was always of the form, Old Tommy, last fall, 12 pounds, right there in White Creek. Took a yellow streamer out of a pile of dead limbs. The biggest sauger I ever saw myself was 1¼ pounds, and I'm not totally sure that wasn't just a baby walleye. And I could tell you more tales about fish that he caught than you would ever believe. But I won't tell you, because I wasn't there to verify them. But they were true. Now, maybe the first thing you're going to say, without even hearing about them, is that the fishing stories about old Tommies were exaggerated or untrue. That's wrong. I myself invented a test of the truth of such stories told at the dock about fish that were so huge they broke the line, got away at the boat, etc. I called my test the V-test, and it comes from the fact that the V-shaped berths or slips, as you might call them, in those wooden docks were particularly hazardous to tall tellers. That's because the tall tellers would get carried away with elaboration or extenuation in such a way that they would get careless. And as they come in closer to their listeners in an attempt to be more convincing than the real story might actually justify, they have a tendency to step out into open space of the vacant V-slip and plunge into the green dock water and end up sputtering and clutching to a slimy dock flotation barrel with the final tour de force image of the story undelivered for his listeners' purview. They also had a tendency to drop rods and reels, gas cans, trolling motors, and lunch boxes through the same trapdoor, always at the part of the story that is most questionable. The one time I was privileged to be at the dock when old Tommy was tolerating a question about the biggest smallmouth he had ever seen in the lake, when the crucial dimension was revealed, Tommy was walking across the open air of a V-slip like a divine angel walking on water. In fairness, when I checked, there was a construction board just below the dock level in about the right place, which Tommy may or may not have used. At that time, I have to confess, I wasn't absolutely certain which of those it was. Of course, even having a magic rod would only be the beginning of Tommy's mythological prowess. Lures, depths, speed of retrieve, location, time of day or night, temperature, moon, no moon, clouds, no clouds, all of that would have to be a part of it. But there were pictures of Tommy with string limits of bass that couldn't be believed. And those are only the fish that he told people about, that he showed up with at the dock. Who knows what his private hauls might have been. Now, everybody was always trying to find out what Tommy's secrets were. He was known to go overland to a different arm of the lake entirely if he thought somebody might be watching him. There were times when he showed up at the dock from a little used direction with a mess of fish and a lure tied to a spinning rod that we all knew was not the one he had been using. Nobody fishes topwater in February. Yet I myself saw a green Dalton Special with big red eyes on a casting outfit once when it was obvious he'd been using brown horsehair lead heads like everybody else on a casting rod. That Dalton Special was a joke, and a good one. Maybe its purpose was to scare the fish so badly with those red eyes that we, the rest of us, couldn't catch any fish. That's the kind of talk that was rife around old Tommy. Of course, Chet Atkins had no reason to hide what he was doing with his fingers. People could see and hear what he was doing, they just couldn't do it themselves. But the real reason Tommy was catching and what he was catching had to have had something to do with the special action he projected to the bait, what we're here calling the melody. And since Tommy fished alone, nobody knew what that was. Maybe it was as simple as a magic rod, but nobody believed that. Now about old Tommy. Although he was known far and wide, nobody that I ever talked to knew where he came from. He'd been there, on the lake, for so long that I guess it didn't seem to make sense to think about what had come before that. The lake itself was only formed by Norris Dam in '36, and it took 2 years for the lake to reach full pool at 10-20 feet above sea level. Of course, Tommy could have been fishing in the Clinch riverbed before that, down at 9-20 feet, but somehow we all knew he got there only when the lake was formed. Old as he was a child of the lake. He was a creature of the TVA and FDR. If he had been set down on Lake Wallenpaupack in the Poconos, I'm sure he would have excelled, but never in a river like the Delaware. Nobody ever saw Tommy fishing in the tailwaters below the dam, which was mainly trout fishing anyway. As has been well documented, there is a rather large divide between bass fishermen and trout fishermen. We bass fishermen have heard about trout and salmon that seem worthy of the chase, but I'm not sure any of us really credits those stories. Certainly not back then, maybe up in Yankee territory or out west. Some people thought Tommy was over 100 years old and had come from far back up in the hills of North Georgia, where it was as dry as a bone and there was no water to fish at all. So how had he learned the fish's ways? Maybe it's better to be completely unacquainted with the whole fishing enterprise and come to it with a completely fresh eye. It was also said that he had 11 brothers, and he had left them all behind, and nobody even knew their names. One afternoon, old Tommy wasn't on his back porch as I slipped by in the woodlot, and I saw a notice posted on his door that told me there was some kind of trouble. Later that day, I had a couple decent largemouth on my stringer, and I felt that I had some credentials and could set foot on the dock, and I heard some of the old codgers sitting around and talking something about old Tommy and taxes. They were saying that they feared that something awful might have happened because old Tommy hadn't been seen for 3 days after a terrible boating accident down near the dam. The way I understood it, and this was not all that easy to put together, was that the Union County elders, fishermen that they were, had offered to mitigate old Tommy's tax troubles if he would go up to a public hearing at the courthouse up in the city of Tazewell and there reveal the deep secrets of catching bass in Norris Lake so that the whole county would be on an equal footing from then on. Tender as my age was, I sensed institutional injustice here. I instinctively knew that old Tommy had earned his special knowledge and bass skill, and this was a plot to deprive him of it using due process as a sham. I felt the same way about my own hard-earned fishing knowledge. Meager as it was in those days, it was mine. Anyway, old Tommy had refused this give up his knowledge deal in a rage and had given up fishing altogether in protest and gone to work on a tourist houseboat down by the dam, none of which seemed at all possible to me, and that a terrible storm had come up and old Tommy had gone over the side and vanished in a huge swirl in the deep water down by the dam. And he hadn't come up, and it had been 3 days now, and basically hope was now gone. But that was wrong, because a few days later I was walking through his woods, and there he was on the back porch like always. I almost waved at him, but I didn't. And now comes the unbelievable part. I heard at the dock he was spinning a big tale about a giant largemouth that had got away in the storm down at the dam, that he had gone into the water with the monster and spent the 3 days down there communing with it, getting advice from it, that sort of thing. But that kind of story was way out of line for old Tommy. As remarkable as his fishing escapades were, nobody ever thought he was lying about even the smallest thing. Deceptive, maybe. Shifty, sure. But this was ridiculous. Nobody would believe a tale like that, even if it was true. I knew something was really wrong. The word was out that old Tommy must have got a whack on the head or imbibed something unusual that his iron constitution wasn't used to dealing with. And he was definitely acting different. But 2 things had changed. Number 1, the tax matter had been cleared up. And 2, old Tommy had agreed to go to the public meeting to reveal his fishing secrets at the courthouse up in Tazewell. This was such an important event in the history of Northeast Tennessee that my folks allowed even me and all of my cousins to go to the meeting. Everybody knew that this was going to be a life-changing, historical event in the history of fishing, if not all of humanity. There was a rumor that Chet Atkins would be there to entertain the crowd. We all got there a good 4 hours ahead and barely got a place at the back. Old Tommy was very contrite. He was dressed in black clothes with a shoestring tie and slickered down hair. My first thought was that it wasn't him, but it must have been, since nobody complained, and there were people there who would know for sure. He sat up there without saying anything for about 15 minutes before starting. And everybody else just sat there too. And then he started. He didn't sound like I thought he would. He was always represented to me to be totally arrogant and short-tempered. But here he was respectful and polite, and spoke slowly with a kind of boiling low feeling. Frankly, I had some trouble following it, but he seemed to be sermonizing some kind of high-level stuff about the spiritual side of fishing and how grateful you were to be a part of it, etc. Now, there isn't a fisherman in the world who won't agree with that instantly, but that gets you nowhere. What's next? And there was the usual stuff about how it didn't even matter whether you caught any fish at all, that it was the search, and there are always going to be unexplained things, even awful things to deal with, and you just have to renew yourself no matter how bad it is and keep going. All that seemed completely obvious to me and must have been widely known to everybody, and I can't have been the first to realize that there was not going to be one single thing in that lecture about how to catch a bass in Norris Lake. And this lack was going to be accepted by the gathering. At the end, there was a sort of gracious, tolerant silence. No applause, no nothing. That settled it for me. This was like church. You listened to the wisdom, but there was nothing specific that might apply to you personally. It was for you to determine for yourself how you might benefit, and the main thing you were to determine was how to get out of there as fast as possible. Frankly, I had just begun to learn that this was all some kind of thing that adults did periodically for their own reasons. In old Tommy's case, to get out of paying taxes to the government. And I swore I wasn't ever going to do it, although later in life I did learn that compromise is in order in some areas. In any case, something did happen in that hall in Tazewell that seemed to satisfy the assembled persons, and we all did disperse in a satisfactory manner. Nor, as far as I could tell, was there any further effect on old Tommy. Everything returned to the way it was, and I had never heard of anybody that brought up to old Tommy that he had once claimed to have spent 3 days underwater with a large bass down by Norris Dam. As far as I know, everything fishing returned to just the way it had always been. And the stories down at the dock about what old Tommy was catching were still beyond belief, but not completely beyond belief. There was a story he had caught a state record size Kentucky bass on a plastic crawdad with pork rind. I personally have never believed there was such a thing as a Kentucky bass myself, but I do believe old Tommy caught one. Now I'm going to tell you 3 pieces of information that I think bear on this whole situation. The first one involves a part of the south shore of Norris Lake called Hurricane, and the third involves Chet Atkins himself. The second may not have been anything. Now, I may have said that I personally never had actually spoken to Tommy. I had heard him speak to others, but I did once technically have a communication with him. One chilly Saturday in November, I had the whole day, so I rode my bike the long way out to a place called Hurricane. At that time of year, when the lake level is low, you can walk the shore, maybe with some wading, that connects to two steep rocky fishing points that jut way out into the lake. It had taken me about 2 hours to fish my way all the way to the point closest to Rabbit Island, and I was catching nothing. I know, and I knew, that fishing is not about whether you're catching anything. We already covered that. But there are times, particularly when the temp is below 40 and there's a steady drizzle, when that belief is more strenuous to uphold. The far point is the best, and I was about to move over there, but when I looked, I saw there was already another fisherman out there. No more than 40 yards from me across the intervening cove. I hadn't seen him. He was dressed in all gray weather gear, and he was landing a fish. A good fish. He hung it briefly up on his de-lyre. That's a little hand scale and tape measure that all honest fishermen carried in those days. And he turned the shining, bright side of what I figured was a largemouth toward me, and he held up 3 fingers, could have been 4, to indicate the weight in pounds. It was old Tommy, who had somehow got out to the main point ahead of me, or, for all I knew, had been out there all day. And he cared to show me his fish before he released it. I could hardly believe it. It was too far across to say anything without yelling, and there was no reason to do that anyway. I thought I could see across that he too was using a dark-colored bucktail. And he might have had a short pork rind on there, I couldn't be sure. I felt pretty meager in old Tommy's presence and wasn't really sure that I could go on fishing under his expert eye. I decided to wait until he started casting first. To my amazement, he walked farther toward the end point of the rocks, which was the best spot for fishing, and the great man pointed to where I knew there was a submerged rock outcropping and looked over at me. I'm no fool, and even at that age I was a dead-eye with a lead-headed bucktail at any reasonable distance. I fired my lure in a magnificent arch and plopped it in what even Tommy would have agreed was the maximally right place to jump my lure over the shelf edge like some hapless diminutive creature that had just fell in. If bass were down there, and if they were biting, this cast would be the right cast. I had no sooner started twitching my retrieve when I felt a slight hit and almost set the hook, but realized that was just my bucktail landing on the submerged shelf 6 or 8 feet down. So at least I didn't embarrass myself by trying to set the hook on a rock. I bounced my lure a little bit, and I eased her over the edge and waited for a strike as it plummeted into deeper water. Then I reeled it in with some lifelike twitches until I had it again on the tip of my rod. No strike. I felt a deep urge not to look at old Tommy, but I couldn't help myself. He gave an elaborate, almost comic shrug with widespread hands and a heavenward look of appeal, and turned and walked over the rocks and out of sight onto the far side. I fished the shelf thoroughly from my side to no avail. And I didn't go over to Tommy's side. The last thing you would do on this blue water earth is follow Tommy to what he thought might be a good fishing hole. You damn well find your own fishing hole. Maybe with a little help from a master if he points one out. Tommy was still on his porch for some years until I went off to college, although I didn't see him up close like before after I got a motorcycle and then a car and I could drive past the front of his house on the road to the lake. The second event that might mean something in the current attempt at explanation was as follows. Sometime in the 80s, I was visiting family and I went down to the dock just for a nostalgic visit. There was nobody I knew down there, and all the counters and such were slick and polished. The old soda chest was gone, the one filled with ice water with the metal rails that held your Coke by the neck until you freed it by putting a coin in a slot at the end. I still wonder how that thing worked so that you were restricted to just the one bottle. Why couldn't you wiggle out 2 bottles? There might be some way to check into that, even today. I hadn't done any fishing in years, and I was kind of ill at ease. I noticed a Gideon Bible up on one of the shelves near a rack of bass lures that I could see had been lifted from the old Howard Johnson's up on 33, which I knew to be long gone. Most of the pages of the book were pristine and untouched, except for one small section, which was greased up pretty good with the kind of fingers that pre-TC W3 users used to mix into a typical 10-horse Evinrude outboard. The greasy part was the several pages of the book of Jonah. The phrase 3 days and nights was circled in pencil. I asked whose Bible that was, and nobody seemed to know. I'll tell you what I thought, and this might tell you more about me than any speculation I might have about somebody else. I thought that old Tommy had planted that Bible years ago in an act of misdirection concerning that whole 3-day tax avoidance scheme back in the mid-'60s. And that Bible was a message to anyone who cared to pick up on it that there is a time when you have to alter the truth, even when it involves a fish, and that's okay as long as you leave behind an explanation. That's what I thought when I put that Bible back on the shelf. Although really, the truth is that I noticed quite a few of the pages were greased up pretty good, and there might have been other parts circled in pencil that I didn't check. Anyway, the Bible was still there after all these years. Nobody risks throwing out a Bible. And now I'm going to give you the clincher. After I retired from my bass lure job in the 90s, I ended up in Nashville and got involved a little bit in the music industry. I thought I might write a song about bass fishing, and a couple guys did do that. But the fact is that bass fishing is just too serious a matter to be sung about. Love is one thing, gone right, gone wrong. Death and sorrow, 2 more. Money, drinks, dogs, guns, trucks, all of it well done. But fishing, well, anyway, I didn't hit it big in the music business. But as a result of that, I was introduced to some of the big guys around town, including Chet Atkins. Now, since we both came from the same dirt-poor town of Luttrell, him when it was a lot poorer than in my time, we had something to talk about, although he said he had in fact spent most of his childhood in a small out-of-the-way place on a mountainside in North Georgia. I asked Chet if he had ever thought of fishing over in Norris when he was a kid, and he said he never really had. And there was no fishing up in the hills in Georgia at all, although his father had a friend over at the house when Chet was practicing his guitar who did nothing but talk about fishing. What they all remembered was that it was pretty strange to be talking about fishing when there was no water around and nobody fished. But the guy had a rod and reel and swore he was going to move to a place where he could fish. They all believed that would happen because of the way he used his hands and fingers so convincingly to handle his reel even with no water in sight. That reminded me of that story about old Tommy's origins, and I asked Chet if he had ever heard of him. He hadn't, but when I described Tommy, he did recount meeting with a guy down in the town of Norris sometime back in the mid-60s who talked a lot about fishing. In fact, he had got involved in a 3-day poker game with this guy who spun all kinds of fishing tales. He remembered that the old guy had some kind of a job involving houseboats up at the dam, and that he wasn't much of a poker player. I have to tell you now, I think that Chet and old Tommy spent 3 days together in the 1960s when Tommy was supposedly underwater talking to a giant largemouth, and Tommy lost money and had to take the Union County people up on their offer to give a paid lecture on fishing to pay his poker debts. And that explains everything, including the only story that Tommy was ever known to have made up about spending 3 days underwater with a largemouth bass. But that story was told so that everybody would know it was not true, and so that doesn't count. Anyway, that's the way I remember the story that Chet told me. I seem to remember that Chet was a cagey old bird himself, so it's possible he somehow ferreted out what I wanted to hear and provided it, just like he provided his audiences over the years with songs that seemed impossible to execute, yet truly fulfilled expectations that his listeners didn't even know they had. Now that does make sense, because people that were born dirt poor in the 20s knew what matters and what's true and what's not. And people born in the 50s like me are barely hanging on to the truth. And if you were born later than that, I really don't know what to tell you. Except there's a Bible down at the dock on Norris Lake with some well-thumbed, greasy pages that you might want to consult that nobody has yet found a reason to throw away.